We're going to look now at some of the theories of sacramental causality. Sometimes in these online video lectures, I like to expand upon and deepen what we read in the book. In this case, I actually want to try to simplify and boil down to its essence what we read. The material in Nut gets into some deep waters, which is good. It gets into some technical matters. I want to make sure that we really understand the essence of what's going on. This material is, we get quite a bit from the book we're reading. There's even more behind this. In the book that Nutt references often by Leeming, the Principles of Sacramental Theology, in that book, Sacramental Causality runs a full 100 pages looking at these different theories and their pros and cons and the arguments behind them. We really want to boil down the essence of this and what's going on. So where does this idea come from? Consider simply some of our scriptural passages that speak about sacramental actions. Take, for instance, Romans 6, where Paul is talking about baptism. Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Just notice the language, that is, something happens. We were buried, therefore, with him by baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. The thing to highlight here, to notice, is that the ritual action has effects. When the ritual action, the sacrament, is posited, something happens. Consider also with baptism in 1 Corinthians 12. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jew or Greek, slave or free, and all were made to drink of the one Spirit. So again, something occurs. There's an effect, and effects have causes. So the language here, even though it doesn't specify it by these words in the scriptures, is it speaks of the sacramental actions as causes of effects. I'll give you another example from 1 Timothy, talking about passing on an office in the church to Timothy by the laying on of hands. It says, do not neglect the gift you have, which was given you by prophetic utterance when the elders, the presbyters, laid their hands upon you. So again, you have this ritual action, apparently accompanied by words, and something happens. There's an effect. This language of the sacraments being efficacious, of producing real effects, is picked up throughout the tradition. I'll just highlight one very strong passage, or very stark passage on this, from Tertullian around the year 200. He's writing on the resurrection of the flesh. And notice the language he uses here. The flesh indeed is washed, meaning baptism. The flesh indeed is washed in order that the soul may be cleansed. Now again, he doesn't use the language of cause and effect, but that's clearly what's implied here. The flesh is indeed washed, cause, in order that the soul may be cleansed, effect. The flesh is anointed, that the soul may be consecrated. The flesh is signed with the cross, that the soul too may be fortified. The flesh is shadowed with the imposition of hands, that the soul may be illuminated by the Spirit. The flesh feeds on the body and blood of Christ, that the soul likewise may fatten on its God. Very, again, clear, striking language there, but it's this language of cause and effect. The sacramental action does something. So questions clearly would start to arise surrounding this notion of the sacraments doing something. If the sacraments cause grace, they cause these sacramental effects, the question is how. And one of the first things that happens in church history is surrounding the question of the worthiness of the minister. We don't have to go into a whole history, but already in the 3rd century, there were questions about rebaptism. If someone is baptized out in a heretical sect, in a group that's left the church, and they come back, do they need to be rebaptized? St. Cyprian in the early church around the year 250, 256, right in there, St. Cyprian said, yes, they need to be rebaptized, and it was Pope St. Stephen I who said, no, it's the tradition that we don't rebaptize. And so this gets at the idea that even one outside of the church, even a fallen away person can validly baptize. This comes to the head again with St. Augustine in the 5th century when he's dealing with the Donatists. The Donatists, again, one of these sects outside of the church. What happens when they baptize? Augustine's going to say, no, they're valid baptisms and ordinations for that matter. So this is the first element, is this objective efficacy of the sacraments. And this is where we get the language of ex opere operato. The Latin there literally means by the work worked, right? So that is, the sacramental causality occurs by the very positing of the ritual act. In reference to our previous videos, or previous lectures, we could say that the sacramental effect happens, occurs, takes place when the right matter is combined with the right form by the proper minister with the right intention. The sacramental action happening, the work worked. So the idea here is that God mediates his truth and his life to us in many ways, usually or often through some human personal agent, right? So think God's teaching is mediated through the scriptures, human authors. His teaching is mediated through the magisterium, which is made up of human persons, right? The sacraments are mediated through human persons, through the human minister. And in each of these cases, these ministers are fallible human beings, sinful human beings. So is there some guarantee of objective efficacy, that we don't have to worry that the personal sinfulness of the human intermediary is going to lessen or is going to obstruct the objective efficacy of the sacraments? Well, with the sacraments, God guarantees them by an intrinsic objective efficacy. This is again the idea, I don't have to worry if my priest is in private a scoundrel. I don't have to worry if he's really bringing me Christ in the Eucharist, or if my sins are really forgiven in the confessional. So here's one of the elements of ex opere operato causality. The validity of the sacraments is independent of the goodness of the minister. It is, well, as St. Augustine says, the Father stressed that in each of the sacraments, it's Christ who acts through his unworthy minister, as St. Augustine says. Peter may baptize, still it's Christ who baptizes. Judas may baptize, but it is still Christ who baptizes. Again, this comes out of those rebaptism controversies in the early church. This comes out of St. Augustine's struggle with the Donatists, that the sacraments have a guarantee, an objective guarantee of their efficacy for the faithful. Their validity is not contingent on the goodness of the minister. So you have to fast forward a little bit to get the language of ex opere operato. The concept is already present in the early church. The formula ex opere operato and ex opere operantis were first used by William of Auxerre in the early part of the 13th century. Ex opere operato there is by the work worked, by the positing of the sacramental action. Ex opere operantis is by roughly by the work of the one working, the work of the worker. If the sacraments were valid contingent on the holiness of the minister, then we would say they work ex opere operantis, right? If they relied on the goodness of the minister. They would work by the work of the worker, right? But we would say, no, they don't operate ex opere operantis, by the work of the worker, but ex opere operato, by the work worked, right? So the distinction there is, again, the sacraments have their own objective efficacy, independent of the holiness of the minister. The Council of Trent takes this language on and says, if anyone states that through the sacraments of the new law, grace is not conferred by the performance of the rite itself, that is ex opere operato, but that faith alone in the divine promise is sufficient to obtain grace, let him be anathema. Now, to understand the anathema of Trent, you have to look at the positive affirmation. This is affirming that the sacraments of the new law confer grace ex opere operato, by the performance of the rite itself. Nevertheless, the intrinsic efficacy of the sacraments, ex opere operato, does not mean that they're automatically fruitful for the recipient. So the sacraments, again, they're not magic, they're not mechanical, they're not automatic in this kind of reductionary way. The recipient has to place no obstacle in their way. So just because the sacraments cause grace, ex opere operato, right? The sacraments are guaranteed objectively to produce this grace, independent of the worthiness of the minister. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily automatically fruitful for the recipient. The fruitfulness for the recipient is based, at least in part, on their own disposition. Thus, we can say, to sum up this ex opere operato doctrine, the sacraments contain the grace which they signify, and they signify the grace which they contain. Again, this has great pastoral consequences. The faithful have an objective guarantee that the sacraments that they receive are communicating grace to them, are producing the effects Christ intended, even if their ministers, known or unknown to them, are not morally good or even morally bad persons. So once this is established, that the sacraments cause effects, that the sacraments bring about grace, it's going to be the next question is, well, how? We saw earlier on that Hugh of St. Victor talked about the sacraments containing grace. Peter Lombard in the 12th century, around 1150, is the first to really use the term cause. What defines a sacrament for Peter Lombard, and this becomes definitional going forward, the sacraments cause grace. So now you've got these two things bound up, ex opere operato, efficacy, right, and the sacraments causing grace. So how do they cause grace? And this is where the book, our book by Nutt, goes into some detail looking at these different theories. We're going to run through a few of them. The first is instrumental efficient causality. Efficient causality, an efficient cause, roughly speaking, we could refine this more, but roughly speaking is an efficient cause is the agent that primarily brings about an effect, right? It's in the if my son builds a Lego tower, he is the efficient cause. He's the one who brings it about. Now, like I said, we could refine that, but that's good for now. An instrument is just that. If I'm writing a poem, the effect is the poem. I am the efficient cause, but I might use a pen or a computer as an instrumental cause. This is the kind of causality we want to talk about first with the sacraments, instrumental efficient causality. This is the position of St. Thomas Aquinas. And our author said, there's some disputes even amongst Thomists on kind of what flavor of instrumental efficient causality Thomas really held to. This seems to be the dominant opinion, what's called perfective instrumental efficient causality. that the sacraments themselves act as instruments of Christ, and they themselves produce grace. Analogously to how a pen in the hands of an author produces a poem. So in this theory, God alone is the primary efficient agent of grace, just as I would be the primary efficient agent of a poem, right? Only God can produce grace. Only God can produce grace. So in this theory, it's not the sacraments somehow magically or of their own selves produce grace. It is God as the primary agent. The sacramental rite is an instrumental secondary agent, but notice here, a real causal element bringing about the effect. So if I'm writing the poem and you take away my pen, you really take away the effect. The poem no longer gets written. So the pen contributes something to the causal effect, and therefore so does the sacramental rite in this theory. So an instrumental agent, like a pen or in this case a sacrament, involves three things. The instrument itself acts under the influence of the primary agent, so the pen doesn't pick itself up and write a poem. And the sacrament only operates because it is Christ himself as the primary agent. The instrument must contribute something proper to itself. So in the case of the pen, if it's blue ink, my poem is going to come out in blue ink. If it's a pencil, it's going to come out in that lighter, lead, whatever pencil looks like. It's going to look different, right? If there's no ink in the pen, or if the ink is running out, it'll come out really sketchy. So the instrument contributes something proper to itself. And think here, baptism. Baptism is a washing with water. That symbolic action contributes something of its own kind to the effect, a spiritual washing, right? In as much as the Eucharist is not the sacrament for spiritual washing, right? Bread and wine isn't used for washing, so it's not used for the washing of the soul of baptism. So the sacramental sign itself contributes something proper to itself to the effect. Right? The Eucharist is another good example. Bread and wine nourish. And so we're nourished by the Eucharistic food and drink. And therefore, in the effect, there must be something which can be attributed to the instrument as cause. So once the poem is written and it's on paper, you can look at it and say, aha, it was a red pen. I can tell. Or it was a glitter pen, right? I can tell the instrument contributed something to the effect. That has to be the same. That has to be true in the sacraments as well. If you remove that instrument, the effect does not take place. There's something in the effect of, say, the forgiveness of sins that can be attributed to the confessional that can't be attributed elsewhere. So here's in this fantastic diagram. Should give you this a little bit of a visual look at this. In instrumental efficient causality, it is God who uses the sacrament to act on the individual, hence the arrows. God, arrow, uses the sacrament as an instrument to then act on the individual, producing grace or causing grace in the individual. Now, this has the benefit of according very well with ex opere operato causality, and this is what the book by Nutt tries to bring out, I think, towards the end, is this strongest, maybe perfective, instrumental, efficient causality gives a full and robust account of how the sacraments could have objectively guaranteed efficacy. It's because they're being used as instruments by the primary agent, who is Christ, who is the second person of the Trinity. There's a direct intrinsic connection between the sacramental cause and the effect of grace. There's a tight link between the two. One of the challenges to this, or one of the questions that it leaves, or two questions we could say. One is, how does a material element like bread and wine or water or oil or laying on of the hands, how does that cause an immaterial, invisible, supernatural effect? It seems that the link there isn't obvious. There seems to be some explanation needed, at least, how a material, natural thing can produce an immaterial, supernatural effect. Another question with this kind of causality is how the sacraments can have continuing effects even when the sacramental cause is absent. So how is it that the sacrament of the Eucharist, I think this is an example from the book, the sacrament of the Eucharist continues to have an effect of grace in the soul of the person who receives it long after the instrumental cause is gone. And not just a static effect, like right when the pen's done writing, you still have the poem in front of you, but this seems to be almost a continual effect. It would be like the ink keeps appearing on the page, right? How is there more grace continuing? A perfect example of this would be, well, actually we'll see a perfect example, because one of the responses or one of the solutions to this is to change instrumental efficient causality a little bit, not call it perfective, not so it directly produces grace, but to call it dispositive or intentional. So this is a variation that our book mentions, a variation on instrumental efficient causality. As opposed to causing grace directly, this produces the sacrament would produce a disposition in the person that would be a kind of title or almost a right to grace. So in this theory of causality, the sacrament effects of the individual, that's a typo. The sacrament effects on the individual the disposition to receive grace, right? The sacraments as signs don't produce grace itself, but a kind of a title to grace in the recipient. So somewhere I've seen this frequently mentioned is with the sacrament of matrimony or marriage. The sacrament of matrimony, since at least the 16th century, has been called a continual sacrament, a sacrament that perdures through life. So that is, I received the sacrament of marriage 10 years ago when my wife and I pronounced our vows, but that sacrament remains. We live a sacramental marriage today, 10 years later. And because of that, we can draw grace from this. Well, how could that be? How could that be? The sacrament causes grace at the moment of its conferral, the exchange of vows, but it was Robert Bellarmine who called it this continual sacrament. Robert Bellarmine, by the way, 16th century Counter-Reformation Catholic theologian. He called it a continual sacrament, and a lot of later authors will say that one of the elements, the effects of a valid marriage, is that not only does one receive actual grace at the time of marriage, but one receives a disposition, or this word title, a kind of a, in quotes, right to grace in the future when one needs it for that state in life. This is a kind of dispositive causality. The grace, the sacrament produces in me a disposition to receive grace in the future. In this schema, it's a little bit different, but remember before it was God acting, using the sacrament to cause grace in the person. Here, the sacrament produces an effect in the individual that then disposes one to later or subsequently receive grace. So similar, but slightly different. What this loosens a little bit the relationship between the sacramental rite and the effect, grace. So it would seem to still have a guard the ex opere operato, like objective guarantee of causality, but it loosens the intrinsic connection between the sacramental rite and grace a little bit. It posits this middle term. It doesn't get out of the problem of how does a material element cause an immaterial supernatural reality, because whatever this disposition is itself invisible immaterial reality, so there's still that problem as well. We can go on. Moral causality is another, when you think of causes, we don't often think about this, but we encounter these kinds of causes in life, and so this is another one. We experience efficient causality all the time. You slam a door and the picture falls. You actually, picture falls off the wall. In that case, you actually have an efficient cause, you, the one that slammed the door. An instrumental cause is the door itself, and then the effect is the picture falling. But we also have something called moral causality that we see all the time as well. As far as the sacraments go, this can be seen in a figure by the name of Melchior Cano, a Dominican who died in 1560. So again, a Catholic counter reformer. In this kind of causality, God is the real and really only efficient cause. He alone causes grace. So this is this kind of removes us from the question of how does a material thing cause an immaterial supernatural effect. This gets rid of that. It says it doesn't. The sacrament itself doesn't actually cause grace. Notice we're outside of instrumental causality now, right? It's the sacrament is not the thing in any way causing grace directly. Okay? In this case, the sacramental rite is similar to a prayer or a pleading. It pleads with God to produce grace. So to give you an example of this, we're in class, it's getting cold, and Bill or somebody gets up and closes the window. In that instance, let's say Bill is the efficient cause of the window closing, right? He got up and did it. We could even say his arm is the instrumental cause, if you want to split off arm and the person, right? But now, let's say I'm getting cold in class, and I say, hey, Bill, could you close the window? I contributed something to that effect, but I wasn't the efficient cause. I'm not the one who brought it about. I wasn't an instrumental cause. My asking was a moral cause, right? I pleaded with him. I cajoled him. I asked him. I moved him by my request. That's a moral cause in the sense. By the way, it has little to do here. I think nothing to do, little or nothing to do with moral as in the sense of good or evil, right? It's this sense of motion by request, we could say. The sacramental rite in moral causality, its dynamism looks to God rather than the recipients, right? In instrumental efficient causality, the first one, the sacrament, its dynamism, its motion was on the recipient, right? Now it's on God. It turns, the sacrament doesn't look to the recipient, the sacrament looks to God, right? Again, whereas in instrumental efficient causality, the dynamism is on recipient-oriented. So here's the little diagram on this. The sacrament now, we could say, you don't want to say acts on, you would say is directed toward God as a plea to produce grace, and then God is the one who produces grace in the individual. Now this, again, seems to lessen even more the tie to ex opere operato causality, and our author brings this out. What's the guarantee here? There's no intrinsic guarantee that the sacrament will produce grace. That seems to be one of the strengths of instrumental causality. Is God has established an order in which the sacraments cause grace, just like he established an order in which gravity causes things to fall. Well, he's established an order in which baptism done according to the rite of the church produces grace. That seems weaker here. Our prayers, if this is likened to a prayer or a pleading, our prayers and pleadings fail to bring about the effect we hope for all the time. So why are the sacraments different? Why would they have this ex opere operato guarantee of causality? Occasional causality. This is, generally speaking, a Franciscan school of thought, or the major representatives tend to be Franciscan. Again, in this, God is the real and only causal agent of grace. It has that in common with moral causality, and therefore differs from instrumental causality. Again, in this schema, the sacrament itself doesn't cause grace directly. In this theory, the sacramental rite is a sign. That is, it has a relationship to God's design to give grace, and this is due to the prior ordination of God. So that is to say, this ordination, the idea here is that God has set up a pact, an agreement, you could say a covenant with his people, that when you do X, I will infallibly bring about Y. So the pact, the ordination, is when you baptize with water in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, I promise to always be there and give grace. Now this seems quite a bit like instrumental causality. I was just saying God created a world in which when you baptize it causes grace. But now the connection is extrinsic, right? It's not intrinsic to the sacrament. It's not something built in. It's not something having to do with the nature of the sacrament itself. Now it's the causal link is extrinsic to the sacrament. It's only based on this promise or pact. So in this sense, the sacraments are occasions through which God himself produces grace. Again, a lot of times you'll see this is an analogy to like Christmas. Christmas is an occasion for giving presents, but Christmas itself doesn't cause presents. And we could say a very benevolent and good parent might make a pact, right, or ordain it as such, that every Christmas, no matter if they're good or bad, their kids get presents, right? This would be an occasional causality. There seems to be a very strong link that on Christmas presents happen, but Christmas itself doesn't cause presents. This is the kind of causality for occasional causality. The sacrament of baptism doesn't produce or cause grace. It's the occasion for God to infallibly bring it out. I think much can be said about the ex opere operato causality here. If God promises it, it shall be infallibly. But again, the direct link between the sacrament and the effect seems to be severed here almost completely. Now, I should note, our author, Nutt, tends towards the last few pages to really downplay anything except instrumental efficient causality. I think he oversteps that a little bit. It seems to me in my reading that the various theories we've looked at all account for the data of revelation in the tradition, even if they don't do so equally well. I think they're all open positions for the Catholic theologian. I tend to think he criticizes that, but he and I would part ways on that for what it's worth. Symbols as causes. Now here we're turning to the 20th century. He kind of makes this turn to the 20th century by looking at autocausal and the idea of mystery presence or presence in mystery. And I have nothing to add to his description of that. It's a very good description. I thought I'd add one more here because, again, this is the turn in the 20th century to get away from language of Aristotle, of efficient causality or instrumental causality, and to take on language of things like symbol. So Karl Rahner in the 20th century attempted to bring together the sacraments as signs or symbols and sacraments as causes. So you can see this in his really dense essay, The Theology of the Symbol. So just one quote to get the basic idea, I suppose. In all these theories, kind of meaning the ones we just mentioned, in all these theories, it's noteworthy that the fact that the sacraments are signs plays no part in explaining their causality. Their function as signs and their function as causes are juxtaposed without connection. Remember, if you go back, Augustine put sacraments in the genus or in the basket of signs. And for Aquinas, that's what they are. They're a particular kind of sign. They're signs that are efficacious. They bring about effects. Rahner here is saying, boy, in all these theories, those two things aren't connected. That the fact that they're signs and that they're efficacious. The axiom everywhere quoted, Sacramenta significando efficient gratiam, that is, sacraments effect grace by signifying, he says that axiom is not in fact taken seriously. Always and everywhere men have had the conviction that in gestures and rites and figurative representations, what is signified and pointed to is in fact made present, precisely because it is represented, and this conviction should not be rejected offhand as analogy magic. So he gives this, in his article, this rather dense philosophical theory of symbols, and says all of reality it's very dense. All of reality is real, is itself, insofar as it signifies itself outward, right, to the other. And so he's got this kind of dense metaphysics of symbol. And he'll point to the human person, especially our bodies, as an example, that we are who we are because we symbolize our spiritual selves to others and to the world. And he'll say that incarnation was the same or similar, that a thing becomes itself, it is itself by signifying itself to the world. So he's going to want to connect sign and or symbol and causality in this 20th century move towards away from the language, I suppose, of efficient causality. So those are our theories. What difference do they make? For now, let's note a few things. One, it shows that it should at least show us that when theologians use these terms and when we use these terms, like the sacraments cause grace, they're not just throwaway terms, right? They're not just truisms or platitudes, that there's really content behind them. Even if it takes 100 pages in a technical work to explain it, we should realize that these words have true content that needs to be taken seriously. When it comes to the sacraments as causes, pastorally speaking, I think this is one of the elements we need to recapture, and so having some familiarity with the discussion is important. When one goes to baptism prep, or one teaches baptism prep, one soon realizes that not everyone understands that something is happening to their child when their child is baptized. Baptism in many areas has become a social convention or a family tradition, and what's lost are the true depths of sacramental causality, that something radical is happening to that child. There's a great loss of faith in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, that with words, with the sacramental words over ordinary matter like bread and wine, something tremendous and radical happens to the very being of the bread and wine, that we have this transubstantiation. That marriage, when two people exchange vows, there is a new reality brought into existence. There's an effect that creates an indissoluble bond, and that bond is as real as the couple themselves. So throughout all the sacraments, there's really a loss of a sense of the true causality of the sacraments and the depths of their effects. So I think we'll leave it at that for now for sacraments and causality. And in future classes, we're going to turn specifically to those effects and look at grace, because what sacraments effect is sacramental grace.